We've got lives, and I've got children, and you know the effort that we put in, cuz we worked really hard. George Harrison, a name that always seemed gentle and calm, was in fact the very person who made Ringo star. The quiet drummer of the Beatles bitterly say, "I used to really dislike George." In a discreet interview with Rolling Stone, Ringo revealed for the first time the hidden sides of George that most Beatles fans never heard about. A personal involvement with another member's spouse inside their own home, being detained due to possession and handling of controlled items on a significant scale, and even financial disputes with Paul McCartney after the Beatles split. What finally made Ringo, known for being polite and private, speak out after more than 40 years of silence? And behind the seemingly peaceful relationship between him and George Harrison, what else was being concealed? It wasn't the studio. It wasn't business, and it wasn't an artistic argument. One of the deepest wounds in Ringo Starr's heart began in the most private place, the home he had once tried so hard to protect from the storms of show business. The story took place in the early 1970s, when the marriage between Ringo and Maureen Cox, the woman who had been by his side since the days of hardship, began showing signs of breaking. But no one in the scene expected that the person contributing to the collapse would be George Harrison, a close teammate for over a decade. At that time, George was living at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames, having just released All Things Must Pass and becoming a symbol of spiritual artistry through Hindu philosophy, meditation, and compassion. Yet beneath that serene exterior was a chain of personal crises he kept hidden. George's marriage with Pattie Boyd had also deteriorated. After repeated arguments and many nights George disappeared without explanation, Pattie felt suffocated. In her memoir, Wonderful Tonight, she recalled a shocking detail. Maureen, Ringo's wife, often visited George's home, even when Pattie was away. At first, Pattie assumed it was small talk between friends, but gradually the closeness between Maureen and George became so evident that it could no longer be explained as friendship. Once Maureen stayed overnight, saying she was avoiding photographers outside the gate. George offered no explanation. Pattie didn't ask, but after that night, she began sleeping in a separate room. In late 1973, Ringo returned from Los Angeles after finishing his solo project, Ringo, and was warned by close friend Lars Vorman that something wasn't right between George and Maureen. According to You Never Give Me Your Money by Peter Doggett, Ringo went straight to Abbey Road Studios where George was recording and confronted him. There was no concrete evidence, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only a heavy look of disappointment and Ringo's cold, piercing sentence, "I know everything." Silence filled the room. A technician present told BBC Radio 2 that after a few minutes standing still, George said a sentence that froze the entire studio. "I care about her. No one dared." Ringo left without a word for weeks after he cut all contact with George. Maureen remained silent in front of the press. George refused all questions, issuing only a brief two-line statement to Apple Records. "We do not comment on private matters." Although no official legal dispute was made public, court documents from the London High Court indicate that Ringo filed for divorce in July 1975, citing irreconcilable hurt. The identity of the third party was not stated, yet within the artistic community it was quietly understood. The hidden name was George. After that, Maureen almost disappeared from public life. She lived quietly in Sussex, rarely appearing before reporters, avoiding interviews, and cutting ties with the remaining Beatles members. Hounded by the media for more than a year, she fell into emotional distress and underwent treatment at a private clinic in Wiltshire. According to the Beatles, off the record. As for George, months after the incident, he publicly began a relationship with Olivia Arias, an administrative staff member at Dark Horse Records. They soon married and had a child. George never mentioned Maureen again in any interview, even after her passing in 1994 due to illness. For more than 2 decades after the event, Ringo avoided collaborating with George in any form. Any invitation from George was politely but firmly declined. In Apple Corps meetings, Ringo spoke only through intermediaries or his assistant. No one in the industry ever saw them sit together again the way they had during the Hamburg tours or the Ed Sullivan Show tapings. From a friendship that once meant sharing blankets backstage and drinking together in dressing rooms, Ringo now saw George only as someone he once knew. Years later, in a letter to director Michael Lindsay Hogg, Ringo wrote a single sentence believed to refer to George. There are people who leave you not by walking away, but by actions they never apologize for. And that was only the first fracture. Because just 1 year before that dramatic event, George Harrison had already been caught in another controversy. This time not about relationships, but splashed across front pages where he was detained in a raid that plunged the Beatles into chaos. On the morning of March 12, 1969, in the thin mist covering Henley-on-Thames, vehicles from the Metropolitan Police quietly entered the front gate of Friar Park, the home of George Harrison and his wife Pattie Boyd. It was 6 a.m., and George had no idea he was about to face one of the biggest shocks of his career. The search warrant was signed by Inspector Norman Pilcher, known across the UK for sweeping operations involving artists. He had detained Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, and Donovan in the 2 years prior. Pilcher was the name that made every band in the 60s and 70s uneasy, as he often appeared without warning. According to the Times, officers found a small amount of controlled items stored in a lacquered wooden box near George's audio equipment in the living room. George and Pattie were separated for questioning. The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours before lawyers were called. The police's initial statement only said, "A well-known musician is under investigation for possession of a controlled item." But the press needed nothing more. Within 12 hours, George Harrison's name was on the front page of newspapers from Daily Mail and New York Post to the Sydney Morning Herald. Once considered the most disciplined Beatle, George's image began to shake. Before this, he was known for meditation for living in ashrams in India. Quoting the Bhagavad Gita, speaking of transcending ego and detaching from material, he once said, "Music is a path toward awakening." But behind that spiritual image were truths long whispered about in the scene. According to George Harrison, behind The Locked Door by Graham Thompson, George often hosted late-night gatherings at Friar Park. Guests included artists, directors, designers, and people whose identities weren't always clear. Strong drinks, ambient music, dim red lights, a hazy atmosphere, all of it formed a world completely different from the pure spiritual image he presented to the public. Some informal sources even claim that John Lennon attended several of these gatherings, especially in 1968, when he and Yoko Ono began exploring expanded awareness through certain experimental experiences. The Evening Standard once published a piece by Ray Connolly hinting at a London circle of artists whose boundaries between art, intimacy, spirituality, and influence were blurred. No names were stated, but the description matched the environment of Friar Park. Although no official allegations were made about personal conduct, George's public image after the detainment remained clouded in doubt throughout the 1970s. He still meditated, still wore prayer beads, still organized concert for Bangladesh. But the public no longer viewed him as the light of the Beatles. The most shocked member was not Paul or John. It was Ringo. He knew George wasn't a monk, but he never imagined that the person who preached enlightenment could be detained right inside the home he used for meditation. In his 1983 interview with Timothy White of Rolling Stone, Ringo said, "I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed." It was disappointment not only toward George, but toward the trust he had once placed in a longtime friend. The incident seriously affected the Beatles' activities. EMI and Capitol Records held an emergency meeting and paused media campaigns. Their next album release was delayed by 3 weeks. John did not attend meetings. Paul stayed quiet. Ringo, for the first time, requested not to sit next to George during joint interviews. Their relationship began to fracture. No arguments, no open conflict, just a cold distance. Quietly understood, affecting both their personal and professional lives. After the detainment, the press did not let go. Articles resurfaced about George's mysterious absences during the 1966 U.S. tour, stories of his appearances at Chelsea gatherings with unknown companions, and leaked notes suggesting George had joined a private meditation group with several controversial figures in the contemporary art world. No one could confirm anything, but everyone understood George Harrison was no longer the quiet Beatle. For Ringo, the detainment was not just a scandal, it was a moment of revelation. The moment he realized George was not the person he had believed him to be. The image of a companion who once shared conviction and stood with them on the Shea Stadium stage in 1965 now remained only as a tangled, regretful memory. Do you deliberately try and create these sort of screaming reactions? No, we just, arrive at the theater and they're always there. While the press was still busy writing about that scandal, another upheaval quietly exploded.